Ocean Conservation by Sean Seymour. Who is Sean Seymour? That's me. I'm a marine scientist and conservationist from northern New South Wales, Coffs Harbour. If any of you know it, awesome little town. Before COVID hit, I was recently stationed on a lonely island in the remote northern atolls of the Maldives, and that was a pretty awesome experience. And then COVID happened, and I had to come back to Australia. But if I bring up the Maldives a lot during this lecture, it's because I learned a lot over there. Pretty eye-opening experience. So what is this lecture about? Today, I'll be giving you a brief lecture on ocean conservation, and particularly we'll be looking at two different but really pressing issues that are impacting our oceans, and they're actually rarely discussed in mainstream media and in general. The aim of this lecture is to not only provide information about these issues, but I want to open up a discussion about the role in the forthcoming generations will play in fixing the future and what our steps as a generation now entail. Hopefully, I give you some good insight into these issues and ways in which we can minimize our impact and strive for positive outcome in the future. You're also going to see that these two topics deserve our immediate attention. I want to give a thank you to Hannah for setting this up. Such a legend. I've known Hannah for a while, since she was 14. We had like a SharkNet rally down at Burleigh, a big protest, and Hannah came and she did this speech, and it was such a good speech and so inspirational, and we've been friends ever since, and I find it really inspirational and motivational. So if you ever want to have a good discussion about the environment or politics and how those kind of correlate, Hannah's a really good person to talk to. She's very knowledgeable on it all. So thanks, Hannah. And quickly before we get into it, I just want to say I have really bad hay fever today. So my voice is very nasally and I might sneeze a bit. It's just because of spring. So I really get so heavily affected by it, which sucks. So it's never a good time to record, but just bear with me. I've got my chai tea next to me, I've got blueberries, and I've got water. So we'll see how we go. But without further ado, let's get into it. So, a time to talk. Why is it such a good time to talk? Well, 2020 has been a bit of a write-off, as we all know. I'm sure you're in a predicament yourself right now, and it's been maybe a challenging year for you. I know before it all went down, I was living in the Maldives, working my dream job, thinking, wow, this is crazy. And then I had to come back to Australia and it kind of all went on standstill. And this is all just because a guy ate a bat and it shut the world down. So it's pretty interesting. It's a year of uncertainty. And what's interesting is it's highlighting how our current use of the environment as a resource can be extremely problematic for humans. Socially, economically, and it's also very problematic for the health of the planet. What's also interesting is now that we're in 2020, we're seeing a lot of extremities. So we're seeing more extreme weather patterns and changes in our lifetime, which follows from the above point. How we use our Earth is starting to reveal our impact more and more. So that's with extreme hurricanes, cyclones. We're seeing more fires. They're becoming more frequent. And we're coming into fire season right now, and it's quite scary. And then on a positive note, change. Never before have we seen so much demand and strive for change and the implementation of solutions to amend current world and environmental issues. When I was a kid, I was like the only vegetarian, shark-loving hippie in my class. And everyone used to make fun of me for it, which is fair enough. It was a different kind of set of ideas back then. But nowadays, I think it's more on the different side. I think people are starting to wake up a bit. We're becoming more versed in how we are affecting the environment, and it's being talked about more, and it's a really good time to be alive. A lot of positive things are happening and coming to light, so that's really, really cool. So now that that's kind of set the basis of it all, let's get into our first issue, and the first issue we're going to talk about is overfishing. So I wrote no give, all take here, because literally that's what it is. We're taking as much as we can and we're not giving anything back. Alright, so the biggest problem in the world for the oceans and possibly the environment, and no one is talking about it. It's rarely talked about compared to plastic pollution and climate change, isn't it? And yet it is the biggest threat facing our oceans. In fact, scientists have been revealing the rapid decline of life in our oceans and the impacts associated with this for decades and decades. Sir David Attenborough, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, he warned that our waters are facing the biggest threat in their history, with industrial overfishing placing the entire ecosystem at risk. So if he said it, it must be true, because Attenborough's the man and I love him. But yeah, it's quite horrible what's going on, and it's hardly talked about. Unfortunately, the demand for seafood is increasing globally. As it says here, so every year the demand for seafood is increasing, while seafood stocks show downward trends. So if we look at this graph here, we can see it plots the amount of fishing effort and engine power against the catch rate, and this is from 1950 to 2010. What's really interesting is if we look here where the two lines intersect, we can see that a sudden increase in fishing effort, boom, going up, leads to a very rapid decrease in the amount of catch. So that's pretty reflective of what's happening right there out in the oceans. Now, what's really problematic is the ocean is a finite resource. So what does this mean? Finite resource is a non-renewable resource. And non-renewable resources are resources which cannot replenish themselves with the rate at which they are consumed. So other examples of this may be crude oil, fossil fuels, coal, uranium. And unfortunately, because the demand for seafood is increasing globally while the stocks are showing downward trends, fish are like most other things in nature. They need time to recover after harvesting. So when relentlessly harvested, the recovery rate decreases along with their numbers. So it's not a very healthy thing to do. And unfortunately, it's going to keep happening because it is one of the biggest industries in the world. And it's forecasted to be worth $155 billion by 2023. So in the next 3 years. So that's probably why it's not talked about as much, because it's generating a lot of income and supporting a lot of world economies. And this is a pretty good infographic here by WWF. So fish populations essential for food and jobs have crashed by 50% in the last 4 decades. And then if we look from 1970 to 2010, the rate of catch has heavily declined here. So pretty awesome infographic there. So why is it the biggest issue? Well, let's take a look. So first and foremost, over 90% of the world's fish stocks are in fact fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted. This is according to the World Economic Forum, which takes a variety of scientific studies and kind of analyzes them and makes claims based on that. There are many direct and indirect effects from taking life from the oceans. And the first one I want to talk about is climate change. So climate change and overfishing are what I would say mutually inclusive. And that means that they are both separate issues which enable and contribute to each other. So as the oceans are warming, we're seeing a number of rising impacts, such as significant alteration in seawater chemistry, the temperature, and oceanic currents, and coming to light are dramatic changes in life history of living organisms, and ultimately ecological processes which keep our oceans balanced and healthy. So then we throw overfishing into the mix, and you can see how the rapid loss of ocean life in correlation with warming of the seas is a frightening forthcoming scenario. Very scary stuff, and it's happening right before our eyes right now. So the next point we have here is unbalanced ecosystems. So it's a huge problem there's a huge problem with industrial fishing, and fishing in general is a concept of the bigger the fish, the better the catch. I'm sure you've heard this before. Unfortunately, for fishing, for fish species, usually one gender of fish species is larger than the other. And this is obviously problematic when it comes to fishing, because they're catching all the big fish, they're catching one gender, all the time, and that can be problematic for successful breeding outcomes. Generally, when we throw lines or nets into the water, we ultimately have no true control of what we are catching. Yes, humans have evolved their fishing methods to be able to generally target a specific species and size, but this usually doesn't eliminate the chances of hooking a female with eggs, or maybe bycatch attracted by the bait, or unluckily caught up in the gear. So it's pretty, so we have to kind of define that. And then if we're looking at the roles each organisms play within the oceanic system, each role is very diverse and complexly dynamic. And if you think of it in a triangle, this is called the trophic level or the trophic scale. So it's kind of like the food chain. And basically you'll have the predators at the top and the bottom feeders at the bottom, literally. I won't get too much into it, but just as long as you know all the levels interact with each other and they all are important. If one level is over harvested or thrown out of balance, then the whole triangle and the whole trophic scale is put out of balance. So two good examples of the key roles in the trophic scale are, let's say, sharks. So sharks are predators and they maintain the health of fish populations and control the presence of sub-predators, and they do a lot of other things to maintain the balance and health of aquatic ecosystems. And then we have parrotfish, which are another example. So they're herbivorous grazers, they're not carnivorous predators. And basically they keep the algae at bay. They munch on the algae and stop it from smothering healthy coral. And they also chomp on dead and infected bits of coral, and when they chomp on this coral and algae together, they excrete sand, and that physically lines the tropical beaches of the world. So yeah, approximately 80% of the tropical beaches around the world comes from parrotfish crap. If you didn't know that, I love that fact. It's an amazing thing to learn, and it's pretty incredible. So if you ever go snorkeling in the tropics, you'll hear the parrotfishes munching away, and it's quite a cool sound. But yeah, they're just pooping out sand everywhere. Good on them. So they do play an important part in the trophic levels. So if we were to heavily fish sharks or parrotfish, we'd see a huge imbalance there. For example, in regions where intense shark fishing occurs, such as in places in Lombok I've visited, I've seen while snorkeling huge imbalances in ecosystems and habitats there. And it's quite horrible to see what eventuates when predators are taken out of the equation. It was quite horrible to see. Moving on, so we need to talk about the ocean being a much needed resource for island communities. So 10% of the world relies on fisheries for their livelihood. These communities on islands rely on the ocean as a resource for nutrition, livelihood, and development. In the Maldives, besides tourism, fishing is a very crucial part of life, with many young men from the more remote atolls, like where I was based, they're aspiring to be fishermen like generations before them, and this helps them provide for their family and also the islands within the atoll. So very important stuff. Pollution. So when we think of pollution in the ocean, we generally don't think about fishing gear, but it's actually a huge problem. More than half of the ocean's pollution comes from discarded fishing gear. And we have these huge nets floating around out there, killing turtles and migrating animals. I worked a lot with a sea turtle rehabilitation in the Maldives, and we rescued hundreds of sea turtles that were caught in these nets, sometimes cutting them out of the nets ourselves. And it's a pretty horrible thing to witness. And we were able to save some turtles, but a lot of them did perish. So it's quite horrible. And the last thing is a no-brainer. Our oceans keep us and the planet alive. How awesome is that? The oceans are awesome. We're just treating them like crap. So as we know, the ocean provides us with 70% of the oxygen we are breathing. It also regulates the climate and absorbs CO2, which is pretty awesome. So this little infographic here, we could see fishless oceans by 2048. That is a scary prediction, and it is a fact. And a lot of scientific studies have predicted this. And yeah, it's very scary. So what are we doing to ensure this doesn't happen? Management, or should I say irresponsible management. So less than 10% of the world's oceans are protected, and an even lower 2.5% are highly protected. So MPAs, which are marine protected areas, are designed to protect areas from fishing and collecting. And some regions are zoned as no-take areas, which are highly protected areas. So these are the 2.5%. And that means nothing can be taken, which is really awesome. Within some MPAs, fishing is allowed to occur with certain restrictions in place. So we'll have a look at the map here, and this is from WWF, and it basically looks at all the MPAs in the world, how much of the world's oceans are protected. And as you can see, it's not a lot visually. And yeah, that is the 10% and the 2.5% that are protected. And you're probably thinking, well, it's better than nothing. It's a strive in the right strive in the right direction. Yeah, it definitely is. But unfortunately, fishing still occurs illegally within protected areas, which are poorly managed or in regions overrun by corrupt politics. So I don't know if you've been following the news lately, but what happened was in the Galapagos Islands, which are heavily protected, a Chinese fishing fleet made up of hundreds of large trawling vessels was discovered by the Ecuadorian Navy, and they were sitting just outside the economic exclusion zone. The EEZ, Economic Exclusion Zone, is actually an area of the ocean in which a sovereign state has jurisdiction over natural resources, and this is enforced by the United Nations. So these sneaky little guys in their boats were just sitting there and waiting so they could fish on just the other side of protected areas, and that's really problematic, and it's been happening for quite a while. But it's really, really good that it made mainstream media. But yeah, illegal fishing just happens everywhere. In Indonesia, I actually saw a fishing trawler that had how do I get on this? Sorry, that had slaves on board. So they would go to these little islands in remote places and take slaves to go fish and promise them riches. And they basically just chain them and make them fish all day. And they're not allowed to leave the boats. It's actually quite horrible. So these things happen, and it's corrupt. So international waters have no management or monitoring in place, which is horrible to think how much fish is actually taken from those parts of the world that are international waters. And then even in waters that are monitored and catch data is recorded, it's often not recorded properly, and therefore the amount of sea life caught per year is heavily misrepresented by numbers. So that's something to think about. But there are places that are doing quite well. So like Palau is a good example of a country setting the pace to combat illegal fishing. It actually got given a special fund by the Food and Agriculture Organization to police its 500,000 kilometer square marine sanctuary. So that's really awesome. And I think they were one of the first places to have the biggest shark sanctuary in the world. So that's really, really cool. Palau's striving the way for that kind of area and region. Aquaculture, yes or no? So aquaculture theoretically is a good idea. I mean, we can grow our own food rather than take it from the oceans. But unfortunately, it's still very environmentally harmful, and the current reality and climate has had a huge impact on the environment. So most of the seafood consumed today is actually farmed, and I think 80% of the seafood here eaten in Australia comes from overseas and seafood farms. So places like this is a aquaculture farm in Southeast Asia. And this was probably once a flourishing wetland mangrove site habitat, and they clear these big, beautiful mangrove sites, and they put these large-scale farming operations here. And what they do is completely degrade the wetlands on global scale. They're also responsible for pollution and contamination. So they're very horrible, and it seems like most of Australia's seafood is actually coming from these places. Which is a scary fact that I didn't even know until I looked into it. In some scenarios also, it takes twice the amount of wild-caught breeding fish to successfully breed farm fish. So that's a kind of conundrum, isn't it? We're taking more wild fish than is needed to produce farm fish, so that kind of doesn't make sense. Something advantageous is that shellfish and seaweed farming can be positive for mitigating water pollution and combating climate change. So shellfish are actually bivalves, and they kind of clean the waters around them and clean their environment. and they absorb contaminants in the water, which is why you should not eat them, because they can contain traces of metals. And also, obviously, seaweed needs CO2 to survive like terrestrial plants. So farming seaweed can actually be good against mitigating climate change conditions. So that's pretty positive stuff. So I do need to look into agriculture more myself. I know that we do it well in Australia, but there's still a big problem with it, and I feel like technology, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of making it ethical and sustainable in the future, but hopefully we can crack the code on it. So speaking of the future, what do we do moving forward? So yeah, the whole prospect of having fishless oceans by 2048 is quite scary, and there have been no signs of seafood consumption slowing, quite the contrary. And in turn, there's no highly effective world management strategies in place to ensure these predictions will not eventuate. As I mentioned, some countries are taking the right initiative to protect their ocean life and resources, such as Palau, also the Maldives is as well, and Australia in some way. But lack of enforcement and international support is hindering success. We do need more studies to evaluate how we are affecting the oceans from taking life from them, and also how much life we actually are taking. And we need to communicate this to the public in better ways and more frequently. We also should reevaluate the word sustainable. This is something I kind of have... Oh, get back there. Sustainable, this word here. I kind of have a problem with it. Can we really call fishing sustainable if we're using a non-renewable resource? Are we just sugarcoating it by calling it sustainable? So that's something to really think about and maybe ponder yourself. I don't think it is sustainable. These are some pictures I took from the Maldives. So this is on just a little recreational fishing boat that we took out at night just to see how they survived on the ocean, and they're really good at it. And this is from a tuna factory. So these are all tuna cans waiting to get packed, and this is just one wall of these massive sections where there's tuna cans, and this is a big cage full of tuna, and the amount of tuna that was in that place was crazy to see. And what's good about this is that it's all pole and line caught, so no nets are allowed to be used in the Maldives. It's illegal, so they made good strides in protecting the natural resource. But the problem is they're so efficient at catching these tuna that they basically don't even need nets anyway. So it can still be problematic because we don't know how much fish they're actually taking by being so successful at using pole and line fishing. And yeah, the amount of tuna that was being packed in these cans today was kind of staggering. And all these cans were getting shipped off to America and Australia and Japan. So we're a cause of the problem as well, aren't we? So now we're going to get on to the next topic, which is noise pollution. So this guy is just like, shush, you guys are making noise in the ocean. It's annoying. But it's actually more than annoying, it's harmful in the natural world. So let's get into it. So how is sound pollution a type? When I mention the word pollution, you probably think about waste pollution such as plastic and even air pollution and stuff, but rarely anyone thinks about noise pollution. Plastic pollution is something that has really gained attention in the last decade and really enabled humanity to start taking responsibility and altering life as we know it to combat this issue together. Noise pollution is almost never talked about in mainstream media, and it consumes us all. And for our friends under the sea, it may even be destroying the way they live. So the problem is it's an invisible threat in comparison to other pollution types such as plastic and oil. But although invisible, the effects are harshly profound and detrimental to natural ecosystems and ecological processes. Although life underwater seems pretty quiet, sound plays a huge role in aquatic ecosystems, in the life cycles, navigation, socializing, communicating, hunting, etc. So what are the major causes of noise pollution? So a recent study I read said that levels of anthropogenic, which means human-created, So anthropogenic noise have doubled every decade for the past 60 years in some areas. That's crazy. The loudest and most disruptive anthropogenic sounds come from military sonar, oil exploration, and industrial shipping. And here's a little infographic of oil exploration. So quickly, these ships are basically just zigzagging back and forth along the surface, and they'll do this for miles. And they have like a lot of these seismic blasting guns. They're air pressured on the ship, and I think they can have up to 12 to 48 of these. And they fire these repeatedly into the ocean floor. And basically, the sound waves hit the floor and penetrate deep, like miles and miles within the surface of the seafloor. And as the sound waves hit the seafloor, they bounce back and are picked up by hydrophones, which can transmit a 3D map of where oil and gas wells lie, such as here. And then these poor animals are really impacted here as well. So it's pretty hazardous stuff. And then it's also not hard to imagine how sound enters the ocean from everyday type of activity. So think about Bondi Beach in the height of summer, thousands of people everywhere, so much noise and boats and jet skis. Think about a musical festival on Gold Coast Beach and Surfers Paradise, or even a jet ski race or a boat race. So yeah, it's something we do every day that we don't really think about or address. So interrupting life, as you can see from this figure, which was taken from this study here on the right. 2016 study. And what this figure does is basically just show us how noise pollution within the marine ecosystem can give rise to various biological and ecological responses. It can distinctly alter organisms' behavior, physiology, and anatomy in a number of ways. So I'll give you a chance to have a look at that diagram. There was a study in 2017 also. A group of scientists found that a loud blast killed almost 2/3 of the zooplankton in a 3/4 of a mile on either side of the blast. So those two studies kind of demonstrated the severe impacts of frequencies on all organism sizes and types. So yeah, you can look at that in your own time, but it's quite horrible how sound is actually impacting these organisms. Hey. Audio navigation. So navigation is obviously a very important thing for aquatic animals. So whales are a good example of this. They migrate thousands of miles across the ocean annually, and we're actually lucky enough to witness it here. I literally just saw a whale breach outside of my balcony. I'm sitting on my balcony right now and I can see the ocean, and I saw a whale breach. That's awesome. But yeah, we're so lucky to see that. So how the hell do they navigate across the big wide ocean? Well, essentially they use magnetic lines on the Earth's surface to navigate, and also they use temperature gradients. So you can imagine a whale coming from temperate waters and then finding the Gold Coast waters and being like, oh yeah, I'm like halfway there or something. But what they also use is sonar. So essentially sound. And when using sonar, they'll use like echolocation or song, depending on whether they're from the tooth or baleen family. And this helps them create an image of their surroundings for which they cannot see visually. So in the same way that dolphins do, using like clicks and whistles, echolocation. So anthropogenic sound hinders the ability of cetaceans to navigate their environment. Increasing studies are highlighting scenarios in which certain sound frequencies are affecting these animals' internal navigation systems, and this leads to stranding, and it also affects their hunting abilities, migrational travel, and inflicting internal and external physical damage. So in some cases, mass strandings, which is when cetaceans beach themselves due to stress, and then they'll die from dehydration, pneumonia, and sun damage. So these mass stranding events have actually coincided with sonar testing from military operations for decades. So the data correlation is there, and it shows a direct impact of these operations. Extreme sound events can inflict vascular damage on the brain and other organs. Some animals may even get the bends. So this is what divers get when they surface too fast, and it causes air bubbles in the blood. So you can imagine a dolphin or cetacean or any animal surfacing too fast as a result of being stressed from noise, and they get the bends. It's quite horrible, and it can kill them. Communication issues. So similarly to humans, many aquatic animals rely on sound for communication. Humans differ in which we're able to use many forms of communication in addition to verbal. So we're pretty privileged in that way. The ability for animals to communicate with sound is crucial for survival. And recent studies have found that slow-moving vessels, 5 knots, have heavily impacted the communication range of dolphins. So in estuarine environments and river mouths, there's usually 5 knot signs for boats, and that is the maximum speed they're allowed to go. But studies have shown that this speed is actually causing impacts in the communication range of the dolphins. So that's pretty interesting and quite a scary thought. So even in slow-moving boat areas, a dolphin's struggling to talk over us, whales singing less. Is it inhibiting them from feeding and protecting each other from danger, socializing and having fun, just in the same ways we use it? It's pretty scary to think about and sad. This little link down here didn't work on my phone, but if you have Flash on your computer, it probably will. If you click on it, it'll bring up a simulation in which you follow cetaceans, and you can plug in all these certain factors, I think sound frequencies, and the more noise polluting sources you plug in, the more you'll see the cetaceans' behavior change. So that's a pretty good image, right? Useful simulation and imagery right there. So give that a go if you can. So how can we reduce our audio footprint? How do we solve this? I'll run through this quickly, but basically we can evolve technology. That speaks for itself. Like the evolution with electric cars, they're going to get quieter, more sustainable, more proficient, better for the environment. Same with other technology we use in the ocean. Further research into the extent of sound pollution impacts also speaks for itself. We need to know how we affect all organisms on all levels and at what rate, and and where as well. Quietening existing technology and practices, so redesigning propellers, soundproofing, etc. New acoustic standards, so the UN is actually discussing new acoustic standards to reduce noise pollution globally, which is awesome. And in turn, the NOAA wants to look at world ocean sound maps. So much like we saw with the overfishing map, which showed where MPAs are on the map, we can kind of create a digital world map of sound impacts within our ocean. And this is to bring more attention to the issue with visual aid and accelerate management efforts. Visual aid is actually a really good way of accelerating management efforts and enforcing things. So redefining exploration methods. We already talked about the severe impacts of current oil exploration and how it's affecting organisms right now. So we need to look into doing better with that. Also, restrictions on noise-sensitive regions. So we could look at putting restrictions on regions where there are biologically sensitive habitats. So, for example, where organisms might spawn or breed and feed. And then last but not least, awareness and communication to the public and companies. Very important stuff, and we can all play a part in that, which is awesome. So those are the 2 main topics I wanted to talk about with you. And then I have 3 other ones that I wanted to briefly discuss. As the topic's title says, there is more. Other ways we are impacting our oceans. And these are ones that are less talked about as well, but I am quite passionate about and that kind of deserve our attention. So the first one is coastal collecting. So that's essentially just picking up seashells. Sounds crazy, right? But it's actually having a huge impact on shell abundance worldwide. Shell abundance is declining, and this is damaging ecosystems and endangering organisms which rely on shells for their survival. I read actually at one beach in Spain, shell abundance had dropped by 60% due to tourist collection. That is staggering, 60%. And it has such a variety of impacts as well. So increased beach erosion. You can imagine if shells are crushed up, this produces sand. Along with parrotfish, of course. So if we're collecting all the shells, there's less sources for sand, and we're getting increased beach erosion. There's also a decline in the availability of calcium carbonate from shell recycling. and a huge drop in diversity and abundance of organisms which depend on shells ecologically and biologically. So next time you're on the beach and think about taking shells, have a think, maybe research into this in more ways yourself, because it's a pretty interesting topic and we've all been culprits, including me, of taking shells from the beach, and maybe too many. So read into that, I encourage you. The next one I want to talk about is the aquarium industry, which is pretty prevalent in the world, and not many people know how bad it is for the environment. So the aquarium industry is actually a multi-million-dollar industry, and 1 billion fish are sold annually. However, it's causing huge environmental impacts and is pretty ethically challenging. I mean, we've seen Finding Nemo, and we know that he gets taken from his family and shipped across the world, or not across the world, just from the Great Barrier Reef to Sydney. And the poor little guy just freaks out. It's not good for anyone. Here's actually a photo. It came from a warehouse I visited in Indonesia. This is where they were keeping a small white-tip reef shark that could have grown to at least 2 meters, but was hindered by the place it was being kept. And basically it was this massive warehouse full of wild-caught fish and sharks and other organisms and corals. And all these were being prepped to be sold overseas, internationally. So I've seen a few of these warehouses and they're not pretty. This poor shark was surviving in pretty bad conditions. So yeah, most of the organisms within these warehouses are captive bred or caught in the wild. And while more than 90% of over 5,000 species can be bred in captivity, due to the mating behaviors of most saltwater fish, it's pretty difficult to successfully breed them. The life cycles of tropical fish are very complex, especially the breeding cycles. Also, what's really sad is most fish die in transport from captive breeding facilities or from being caught in the wild. They're usually transported and they will sit in holding warehouses and transported to various other places before they reach their last destination. It's obviously a pretty stressful process, and that's why rates of mortality are so high. So yeah, I saw quite a lot in Indonesia. It was quite horrible. So that's something else to think about if you own any aquarium fish, or find out where they come from, if they're wild caught, if they're bred, and how. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting topic, but it's quite sad. The last one is ocean acidification. Sorry, I'm eating blueberries. They're so good. They seem to be helping with my hay fever. I don't know if there's any science behind that, but someone should definitely look into it. Alright, so ocean acidification. So ocean acidification, or OA as scientists like to deem it, occurs when atmospheric CO2 is absorbed by the ocean. So carbon dioxide is in the air and it's absorbed by the ocean. And then what this does is alter the seawater chemistry. So in turn it lowers the pH and reduces carbonate ion concentration, and therefore calcium carbonate saturation. So kind of in the same way that the collecting of shells is reducing the amount of calcium carbonate saturation in the water also. So this is problematic because many organisms rely on calcium carbonate in different life stages. It's pretty much the building block for calcification of skeletons and shells for cephalopods, mollusks, corals, etc. These organisms are inhibited in their abilities to successfully produce and develop and maintain their shells. So to put things in perspective, the ocean pH has dropped by 0.1 pH units, and that was since the Industrial Revolution commenced. So you can see there's a direct correlation between that, the excess CO2 suddenly being released into the air and then being absorbed by the ocean. So not so much a coincidence, more a correlation. And although 0.1 pH units seems like a small amount, it's actually a staggering 30% increasive change in acidity. So these poor animals, we are eating them, hurting their ears, we're using them for entertainment, and then we're making their home acidic. How can we do this to them? It's crazy, isn't it? Also, an important note in terms of climate change and coral bleaching is that coral reefs rely on calcium carbonate to grow and calcify their skeletons. Another interesting note is that algae and other plants may actually benefit from increases in CO2, but this can be problematic because then we're going to have algae and seaweed dominated reefs compared to coral reefs, which can be very problematic for the environment. So those are those. Oh wait, here's a quick little diagram of the impacts of ocean acidification on the life cycle of this shell building organism. So you can see it's quite impactful here. It's horrible. It mutates the whole process. So those are some really good topics to kind of dive into yourself and see how we are impacting the oceans, because it's quite horrible. And yeah, have your own research into those, and maybe talk to people about them as well and communicate those, because they're really not talked about, and they really need to be. So to wrap it up, I just want to give you this amazing quote by Sylvia Earle. Sylvia Earle's one of my idols. If you don't know who she is, look her up, watch her documentaries. She's awesome. So our past, our present, and whatever remains of our future absolutely depend on what we do now. Sylvia Earle, what a lady. I love her. But yeah, it's pretty relative to where we're at right now. We really have to protect our future for future generations, and also our benefit and the benefit of the earth, of course. So it's really important to think about how everyday actions may be impacting the planet on every level. And we need to talk and discuss about this. It's not talked about enough. I try to talk about it with my friends, and a lot of them will get into it. Sometimes if we have a few beers, we'll get into it a lot. But a lot of the time, if I just try to talk to the general public about this, they kind of shy away from it. Maybe gets offensive about it. But we all have to do our part. For me, I have a lot to work on in terms of waste reduction. I still use too much waste than I'd like to. So that's something I want to work on. But I changed my diet. I went vegan for the earth. And I've also dedicated my life to being a scientist and conservationist, and especially for the last 6 years. So there's a lot that we can do as individuals. And also watch documentaries. There's so many good documentaries out there right now for good information and visual representation of what's happening. Read scientific articles. They're awesome. I'm sure you're sick of it doing that at university, but they're very interesting, and they're a good communication for the facts. And then, yeah, communicate these concepts and theories and facts with people, the general public, your friends, your family. Observe what's happening around you. Get creative. There's so many ways that we can prepare for the future, and what we do now will either have a positive consequence or a negative impact. So let's sit on the other side of